Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome once again to another edition of Shaftesbury Society, coming to you from Midtown Raleigh, North Carolina, the headquarters of the John Locke Foundation. Well, we know that more and more North Carolinians are now looking for ways to sell their farm products, whether it's to existing large markets or to emerging niche sectors. But standing in the way of these entrepreneurs is really a web of regulations, and these rules actually impact production and processing. So the rules have a direct impact then on whether or not agriculture is going to be welcoming new players and new products and innovations, or whether those rules are going to squelch that development. Well, today we're talking about a Locke commissioned report that has been written by one of our guests, Professor Vincent Smith, that takes a look at these federal regulations over dairy farming and cattle farming. We're also going to talk about what this means for North Carolina, where we could improve, what it means for emerging markets and farmers here in our state. We're also going to get perspective as well from our two experts on the nation's food supply, things we've learned about supply chain, a phrase that we now all are using that maybe we had never used about 18 months ago. We'll look at food as a national security issue as well. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. Really looking forward to this. Our guest today is the report's author I referred to, Professor Vincent Smith. He is professor of economics, the co-director of the Agriculture Marketing Policy Center at Montana State University. State of Montana, beautiful. He's just telling me how gorgeous it is there. By the way, he has North Carolina connections. In fact, he earned his PhD here at NC State University in Raleigh. Also joining me is my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation, Michael Harden, who is our Vice President of Development. Michael has an incredible agriculture background. He's been in the industry for years and years. He actually has his own family farm he's going to tell us a little bit about in a moment. He's a former state lawmaker in the state of Georgia, where he served on the Agriculture Committee there. Gentlemen, welcome to Shaftesbury Society. Glad to have you with us. Michael, let's start with you if we could, Michael. Give us a sense of agriculture in North Carolina and why this is so vital and why we're looking at this issue today.
Well, Donna, thank you for having me. And Doc, it's good to be with you as well. Look forward to the next hour of conversation. Yeah, Donna, as we all know, agriculture is the #1 industry in the state of North Carolina. And last year, well, going back a couple of years, Locke and our sister organization, formerly Civitas, has been involved in this policy now for a couple of years. And with the onset of COVID, last year we reached out to 800 and something small farms across the state from practically every county in the state, trying to assess how COVID was impacting them. Was life getting easier, harder, and were there any government-imposed roadblocks that maybe Locke could help remove for them to be able to access markets? And so we did that survey, again, surveyed over 800 farms, got a great response, and found out that COVID had really driven consumers back to their local farm because we were seeing slaughterhouses across the state and country back up and different supply chains be hindered. And so when we saw this move back, we saw that a lot of these farms were ready to hit this head on, but we're hitting some roadblocks. And so we decided we needed to go a little deeper at Locke and assess where we stood as a state, how we compared to other states in our region. So we reached out to Dr. Smith, who is a renowned expert in this space across the country. And so he's put together a wonderful study that helps us better understand not only the Southeast and Eastern Seaboard to some degree, but primarily North Carolina and what we can do to remove those barriers where they are.
And that report, by the way, folks, is called Freedom to Farm. You can find it on the John Locke Foundation's website, which is johnlocke.org. And I believe one of my colleagues is going to be posting a link to Freedom to Farm in the comments section of our Facebook page. Make it nice and convenient for you to take a look at the work that Professor Smith has done for the Locke Foundation. Professor, give us a sense of what you found in your report, Freedom to Farm. We'd like you to share your screen with us, if you would.
Well, I absolutely will. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be on this event, and also for facilitating the work that I've done. The John Locke Foundation has been wonderfully supportive and incredibly helpful in facilitating this work. And before I get into things too deeply, I need to mention some Samantha Pfeiffer, who works with the Locke Foundation, who's a fabulous research associate for this program. Let me dive into a quick PowerPoint for you all, so that you can get a sense for the scope of the work we did and some of the key findings. And bear with me as I try to correctly share my screen with you all. I'm now a little bit older than I used to be, so my claim is that
no problem. Right now we're seeing a lovely ocean view along with your PowerPoint. I know you're going to be working to make that full screen for us.
Well, got to confess, it's actually Lake Geneva, but we'll talk about that another time. And let's see if we can get this going. How about that?
Got it.
Are we all set?
We are.
So I'm going to try and run through this material pretty quickly, because the best thing to do is to talk and have a conversation about the work that's been done and the issues that have come up. The scope of the study was as follows. We examined the role and impacts of dairy and red meat production regulations in 7 states. And I should add that federal regulations are very important in relation to state regulations here. One of the key findings of this study is that because of concerns about food safety, the states often defer to the federal regulations in implementing their own regulations. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a few moments. We looked at 7 states, and of course I've listed North Carolina top of the list. And I should add that I have more than one connection to North Carolina. I had a wonderful experience at North Carolina State University. And not only did I get a degree, I also found my wife, who is from North Carolina. We looked at South Carolina, we looked at Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. So basically, we looked at 5 East Coast states, and then 2, quote, landlocked states, Kentucky and Tennessee, to see what their regulations look like. Among those 7 states, North Carolina consistently had the largest by value agricultural sector, as shown in this overhead slide. And South Carolina, in some ways, surprisingly, was consistently the state with, in absolute terms, the smallest agricultural sector. What about the role of dairy and cattle? In all of these states, effectively, while dairy and cattle are important sources of revenue, they're not as important as on average across the nation. For example, cattle sales for farm income account for around about 14% to 15% of the average farm's income. And in most of the states, the share accounted for by cattle is smaller than that. Nevertheless, as I'll show you in a few moments, it's an important product for many, many farms. A similar story holds true for dairy sales, where only Virginia comes close to the national average. But again, as we'll see, many, many farms in North Carolina and the rest of the 7 states have a substantial number of farms that rely to some degree on dairy sales. One of the points that is important to understand is that many very relatively small farms, and many farms in general, have relatively small herds when we talk about dairy. And so this slide just for North Carolina gives you a sense of what has been happening over the last approximately 15 years. Small herds in North Carolina have diminished substantially. A small herd is 1 to 9 or 10 to 19 cattle on the farm. And large herds have grown a little bit. But North Carolina is not a large dairy herd state. But particularly among the smaller farms, and while those numbers have diminished over time, there's still a fair number of them. those are the farms that often seek niche markets for their products and would like, if possible, to do sales from the farm rather than having to send product to a processor and then get it back if they want to market under their name. It's really not feasible for these very small farms to do that. On the processing side in dairy, the small operations predominate. For example, in North Carolina, a quarter of all dairy processing farms, dairy processing establishments have less than 5 employees, and there are 5 of those. There are 4 very large dairy processing facilities in North Carolina. There's a lot of NAs in there, meaning the data are not available. And the reason why the data are not available is to protect, at the county level, information from a particular operation that might be used by its competitors in a disadvantageous way. But as you look across the various states, you can see that smaller processing facilities predominate. And those are the facilities that often are focused on niche markets or within state markets. If we look at the similar sort of information for cattle, what you can also see is that cattle, among cattle, in 2002, there were nearly 4,000 farms that had 1 to 9 head of cattle. And that number declined to under 2,000 by 2017. These data are from agricultural censuses, and the data are only available on once every 5 years, hence not a long time series here. But you can see that smaller herds have tended to the number of smaller herds in the 1 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 49 head of cattle have tended to drop. And what you can't tell really is there's been a very modest increase in the very large herds here. And that pattern is reflected throughout the 7 states. In terms of meat processing plants, overwhelmingly, small processing plants predominate for red meat. In Florida, of the 60 plants, for example, 27 have fewer than 5 employees. In North Carolina, 19 out of 100. That's almost 20, well, that's 19%, very easy number to calculate in your head, have less than 5 employees. And the bulk have less than 50 employees. North Carolina and Georgia are a little bit different in that they do have a larger proportion of very large processing plants. Now, these are all meat processing plants, not just red meat plants. And so in North Carolina, those 10 plants that employ more than 1,000 employees, quite a few of those plants mainly are concerned with poultry and hogs rather than red meat. But these patterns are very interesting, and there's a reason why they exist, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. I wanted to give you some overview in terms of numbers of what the industry at the farm level and at the processing level look like. Now I'm going to turn and talk briefly about federal and state dairy regulations, and then I'm going to do the same for red meat processing. Federal dairy regulation is driven by Section 1240 Part A of Title 21 of the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. Michael is well aware of the lack of fluidity and Shakespeare quality in the naming of regulations. What this regulation, which is really important, says, no person shall cause to be delivered into interstate commerce, that's sending dairy products across state lines for sale, or shall sell, otherwise distribute, or hold for sale, or other distribution after shipment in interstate commerce, any milk or milk product in final package form for direct human consumption, unless the product has been pasteurized or is made from dairy ingredients that have all been pasteurized. And then there's an exception for a very limited number of cheese products. So if you go to the grocery store, you will see some non-pasteurized cheese products, perhaps if you're in North Carolina, from Virginia. But those are produced under a very particular set of production processes that are specified in a considerably complex regulation. So essentially that's saying no raw milk can be sold for human consumption across state lines. And that's important because at the farm level, you are generating raw milk. Almost all milk that's pasteurized is pasteurized at a processing facility. All interstate commerce is subject to federal regulation. Within state commerce is regulated by the state. Now I'm going to turn and talk about raw milk a little bit, because pasteurized milk is widely viewed as not a problem in terms of being sold, but raw milk is certainly viewed as a problem. Only one state, South Carolina, out of the 7 that I looked at, and only 10 states nationwide, permit the sale of raw milk for human consumption. Effectively, almost all milk used in interstate commerce has to be pasteurized, of course, as I just mentioned. And in North Carolina, though they allow the sale of raw milk, they do require farms to conform to strict standards that involve bottling and so on, and regular inspections for sanitary conditions that add to quite considerably to the costs of allocating, of marketing milk. Every other state, with the exception of Kentucky, does not allow any sale of raw milk. And Kentucky, just anecdotally, is interesting in that they only allow the sale of goat's milk from the farm, and only if the consumer has a prescription from their doctor to consume that goat's milk in raw form, because of some health reasons. Effectively, farms that want to sell direct to consumers must operate, therefore, as small-scale, regularly inspected processes, meeting all sanitary and other standards, including pasteurization of the milk, which is very challenging for those farms. So if you go to a farmer's market and you see, say, a company, let's call it Holly Farms, offering their own cheese for sale or their own milk for sale, that's actually gone to a processor that meets state standards in almost every case. Because, as I just noted, it's largely infeasible for the relative multitude of dairy farms with very small herds to operate in that way. And most of the 7 states in this study do not permit farms to distribute milk from the farm to off-farm individuals who own shares in the herd. And so Michael might own a cow on my dairy herd, in my dairy herd. I cannot give him milk from that cow unless it has been processed. It's not allowed, with one exception. North Carolina is an exception to this rule. But that certainly even further restricts the opportunity for marketing of milk. What about meat regulation? Federal regulation and inspection of carcasses at meat packing plants is required for all interstate shipments. That is, all interstate commerce of beef and other livestock products. A major concern here is the health of the animal at time of slaughter. And the way this world operates is that a federal inspector has to be at the plant to inspect each animal before it is slaughtered. That inspector, or that set of inspectors, will also inspect cuts of beef to see that they meet USDA standards. The USDA Food Safety Inspection Service is the responsible agency for the inspection of such plants. and has been in charge since 1906. So these regulations go back a long, long way, over essentially 115 years. But the legislation, the Federal Meat Inspector Act, is amended quite regularly, and most recently in 2020. In addition, federal regulations specify how animals should be slaughtered under the 1978 Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. And there are some exceptions for particular religious belief-related issues. For example, kosher meats. Transport across state lines of live animals is also regulated to ensure availability of water and adequate rest. Now, that's actually a regulation that makes sense, because if a trucker is shipping cattle, say from North Carolina down to Florida for some reason, if the animal is not adequately cared for, its condition will deteriorate and it will become less valuable when it gets to the processing facility. So certainly that is an understandable regulation. And many states have similar regulations for within state shipments. What about state red meat regulation? Well, states can establish their own standards for meat produced for the market, but those standards have to be at least as rigorous as the federal standards. So the outcomes have to be no worse than if the packing plant were being inspected by the federal inspector. States may have their own agencies to inspect meat packing plants on a continuous basis, but such plants can only engage in within state or intrastate commerce. And the states have the option of contracting inspection to the FSIS rather than establishing their own standards. And quite a few states, including several in the group that we looked at, do exactly that. Individual farms cannot slaughter and process the meat from their own animals and then sell the resulting products, whatever they might be, from steak to sausage, to the general public, either at the farm or at a roadside outlet, or through restaurants or through supermarkets. It's just not allowed. However, in most states, they can butcher or have animals butchered at what are called custom facilities for consumption by their own families and workers on the farm. In most states, including North Carolina, they can sell an animal or a share of the animal. So now Michael and I want our own beef, so we go shares in an animal, Donna, that on your farm is located. The consumer, however, in general, must have the animal slaughtered at a custom facility. The farm cannot slaughter the animal for them. But the custom facility is not inspected on a continuous basis. So I want to finish up by explaining what custom facilities are. Custom facilities tend to be very small operations, or pretty small operations. They are inspected for sanitary and other conditions on a periodic basis. I believe, though I don't want to be held accountable for asserting that, I think it's at least once every 3 months in North Carolina. They're typically very small scale operations that in normal times often process deer and other animals harvested by hunters. That tends to be, in most states, their main occupation. During April and May of 2020, when there was significant disruption to the large-scale meat packing plants because of widespread incidents of COVID among employees, many small-scale farmers in particular wanted to have animals processed by such facilities. And they discovered a couple of things. One was these custom facilities tend to be small. They tend to have substantial pre-commitments that take up a very large share of their capacity. Many of these operations can only slaughter and butcher 15 to 20 animals a week. And in an industry where there's a national herd of over 43 million animals, you get a sense of why that's small capacity. In response, congressmen and women, Massey, Duncan, and Pingree, two are Republicans, one is Democrat, put forward the PRIME, the Processing, Revival, and Intrastate Meat Exemption Act, to allow custom facilities to process meat for the broader marketplace, subject to state approval. Now, as I discuss in the paper, the PRIME Act has gone nowhere. There's not been a vote on it. It's not gone to the agricultural committees, and it almost certainly isn't going to go to those committees. There are several reasons why this is the case. One is that groups like the National Pork Association and the National Beef Association are very concerned about the risk of having animals slaughtered in ways that engender human health issues. Also, of course, the large operations don't particularly want to see more competition here. Although the production capacity of, say, 20 small processing plants, each of which can manage an average of 20 animals or 400 animals a week in a state like North Carolina, that's not a lot of capacity. So if that capacity doubled, the impact on the large operations would be relatively small. Now, that's a very brief overview of what we know about the regulatory structure. And let me stop there so we can begin to converse about the issues that arise for the small farm operator and the mid-sized farmer operator in North Carolina and other states with respect to meat processing.
Terrific.
So
Professor, thank you for that overview. And just to remind our viewers that the full report called Freedom to Farm is available at johnlocke.org. You can see all the charts that the professor shared and read his perspective and commentary that is a little bit deeper on what these charts really mean in the southern region for production and processing. And again, if you are watching us on Facebook, there is a link to the report in the comments section of the Facebook page. I'd like to bring back into our conversation my colleague, Michael Harden. Michael, it's really fascinating to look at all these numbers, and then what we're trying to do really is to translate these numbers into the reality for North Carolina. And you having your own small family farm, Michael, I think can help us to do that. Give us a sense of what stood out to you, Michael, from reading the professor's report and listening to some of the highlights there.
Sure. So we've known for some time that the agriculture landscape in America, I mean, it's always changing. It's been changing over the last 100 years. You know, you think back to prior to the 1950s, you couldn't find a boneless, skinless chicken breast in any supermarket in the country. In fact, you could rarely find a chicken of any sort because most people were raising their own. And if you did find something, it was generally a whole bird, and practically every house in America knew how to cut up a chicken to be consumed by the family. And so
My
that
mom
landscape
did that.
is,
I remember that.
that's
She
right.
would cut it up
That's
and we
right.
had fried chicken.
That's right. So it's always changing. And so we've seen for now generations, things become more mechanized, more central, more monocropping, et cetera. And over the last 20, 30 years, sort of going back to maybe the 60s or 70s in the back to land movement, we've seen this desire for more local food. You've seen this if we had a chart to show the participation of farmers markets over the last 20 years, although it seems to have leveled out some over the past couple of years. Over the past 2025, it's grown exponentially year over year. And so we feel like there's this desire to get back closer to your food, knowing your farmer, where the meat's produced, et cetera. You know, one of the things that the doc highlighted on several occasions is, you know, one thing that I'd like the viewers today to everything that's mentioned to look through the prism and the lens of what everyone that justifies all the groups, government at all levels, justify all of these draconian rules and stipulations. They're generally doing it under quote unquote the safety of the food supply. And so although a lot of folks would like for you to believe this is all about food safety, if you think through each thing that we're going to be talking about, you're going to see that that's kind of crazy. And at the end of the day, a lot of times that just doesn't hold water. Like, I know it's not red meat related, but let's talk about on-farm production of poultry. The federal limit is 20,000 birds per farm that you have an exemption. You can slaughter 20,000 chickens on your farm to sell directly to the consumers. Anything over 20,000 in North Carolina has to go to a licensed facility. Now, this is all about the safety of the food supply. What makes those first 20,000 birds safe? And what makes the 20,001st bird inherently dangerous? And so I could go on and on and on about how, rabbits aren't regulated like that practically in any state because there's no big rabbit monopoly in this country. There's no big rabbit producers that are wanting to stifle competition. And the doc mentioned there that when you look at it that way, a lot of these things are, frankly, they're outdated. They were drawn by the lobbyists of a lot of these big corporations. And not that we're opposed in any sense to all these folks having a seat at the table, but at the Locke Foundation, we believe that farmers of all sizes and scales, as long as they're living within the boundaries of as safest product and a knowledgeable consumer as they can, that we should take the guardrails off and largely let consumers and their farmers have relationships. If they know where their food's coming from and the farmer is being transparent, then we believe a lot of this could be removed.
Professor, as you did your research and gathered the data here, specifically as it relates to North Carolina, and to Michael's point, did you find places where you thought, in North Carolina, this doesn't make sense, whether it is a number, a top line number, a ceiling that is put on a production, or the number of hoops that a producer has to go through in order to get a product to market? What did you find where you thought, here's a real opportunity for North Carolina to step out and to kind of free things up and let that market move?
Let's talk about dairy for a moment. There is a legitimate concern about the sale of raw milk. The science says you consume raw milk, you are at a measurably higher risk of suffering from a food-related illness than if you consume pasteurized milk. So the question is, how easy would it be, and I think this is a legitimate question, how easy would it be to modify the regulations so that where a dairy farm can credibly show it does and is capable of safely pasteurizing its own milk, that offers a new pathway forward. I agree with Michael. The chicken rule makes no sense at all. How could it possibly be related to concerns about food safety? Now, for rabbits, it's such a small market in the aggregate that I'm not surprised. But when I was a little boy, myxomatosis decimated the rabbit herd in Britain, and you were told, don't eat any rabbit, because that was of serious concern. It would worry me that rabbits are coming to market without any sort of health evaluation from any source. That seems, to someone who grew up and had that experience in the 1950s, which tells you how old I am, that's a little bit of that is a genuine concern. So food safety issues do matter. But a lot of dairy market regulation has nothing to do with food safety too. And this takes us into the world of federal milk marketing orders, where the claim is they exist to protect the safety of the milk supply. And there was a reason to be worried about that in the 1930s, where what was called unguent fever was a very serious zoonotic transferred from animals to humans disease through milk. You do not want to have unguent fever. It is extremely bad news. On the other hand, that's related to brucellosis. The current rules are really designed to create a monopoly in the sale of milk, so that under these milk marketing orders, higher prices than would otherwise be the case can be charged for milk for human consumption and so on. And what's interesting about the federal milk marketing orders is that, yes, a dairy processor is free to not be in a milk marketing order and is supposedly allowed to jump in or jump out. And there's a reason that we've seen in the COVID-19 era for some dairies to want to jump out of these milk marketing orders, because they can do better for their farmers if they just produce cheese products where the price of cheese has gone up substantially, so the value of milk in cheese has gone up substantially. And the farmer is better off, in that case, if the dairy is out of the federal marketing order. And notionally, if you read the rules, it's supposed to be costless to jump in or out of the federal milk marketing order for a dairy processor. But it turns out that there tend to be barriers to re-entry into that market if you want to go back in.
So it's a short-term versus long-term equation for a farmer.
Right, and these notions of barriers to get back in is simply not justified on any sort of human health grounds. It's justified on the basis that the marketing order managers want the processors to stay in the milk marketing order, even when at times it's not optimal for them to do that. It's not the best thing for them, or because many of these dairy processing facilities are cooperatives, farmer-owned, for the farmers.
You know, Michael, I seem to recall that over the last several years, this issue of raw milk has come up in North Carolina as something that the producers really are looking at. And give me a sense of what you recall of that.
Yeah, great point, and a great analysis there by the doc as always. A few points to some of the things he said, and also to your question, Donna. Representative Rydell a couple of years ago in North Carolina was able to get through, as the doc mentioned earlier, the herd share concept, in that of these 7 states, the only state that allows for that. And basically what it is that although raw milk sales in North Carolina are not legal, if I own a cow and that cow produces 20 gallons a week of milk, then I could cut that up however I want to. Let's say that I sell 20 shares. And so you buy a share into my cow and you get a gallon a week of milk. Now, if raw milk was inherently dangerous, then I doubt anything like that would be able to pass the muster. And also, the thing we have to keep in mind too, to the doc's point, is South Carolina raw milk in stores, the sale of raw milk in stores and retail facilities is legal. And if there were any sicknesses or illnesses derived from that, there are tons of people on the other side of this issue who would love to highlight that. And to my knowledge, there have been none. As far as the safety, there's plenty of products in our society on our store shelves that we have labels for, that if you consume them, if not properly handled, could make you ill, or even if you consume them the way they are intended, they could potentially harm you. If this were all about safety and the government truly cared about the safety of all Americans, would you be able to buy raw chicken in the grocery store? Because arguably the consumption of raw chicken or undercooked chicken or any poultry product has a very good likelihood of giving you salmonella. And so again, we could do the same type of labeling procedures with raw milk. If raw milk became legal to sell retail in North Carolina, put the label on there and say, hey, there's a lot of studies that believe that this hasn't been handled properly up to this point, could cause you ill. But let's let the consumers figure that out. And so the fact that so many things in our grocery stores are legal, even if handled improperly, to me, just doesn't add up. I don't believe this is about safety. I don't believe this is the government looking out for all of us and our good health. I believe this is about protectionism. This is about folks wanting to limit competition, and they're doing it again under the quote unquote safety of the food supply argument, which again, just doesn't hold water.
You know, Professor, I think that's a fascinating line of discussion that Michael's brought up here, because I can tell you Thanksgiving is coming up, and I can recall that there's always news stories that are produced, particularly from like the Butterball people when it comes to turkeys, about, here's what you need to do, and most importantly, don't do when you're preparing your turkey. And one of them has to do with that internal thermometer and making sure that you cook it thoroughly. So if there are some products in which we are comfortable as a society and through our regulatory scheme that we can trust, quote, and I use that word in quotes, trust people to make those decisions for themselves, why is it that there are other products and areas in the ag industry where we don't presume that people will make those responsible decisions and understand the consequences if they don't?
Boy, what a can of worms you just raised.
You're the expert. I'm hoping you can open that up.
Well, where a product is inherently known to be more risky, and a raw product, in this case raw milk, is inherently known to be more risky, and there is no credible evidence that it has health advantages, then at the very least, you need to have red letter labeling on the product. And I think that's Mike's point. I mean, just to be really controversial in North Carolina, there's a reason why every packet of cigarettes has a major health warning on it. And raw milk could be dealt with in the same way. The challenge, of course, is that producers of raw milk are then going to lobby and want to get rid of that label. So we have, quote, bad actors everywhere. Just because you're producing pasteurized milk or raw milk doesn't mean you're a good actor. And most farmers are good actors, by the way. I'm so impressed with the integrity of so many of the farmers that I know. But it's the bad actor you worry about. So at the very least, you need to have a clear warning for the consumer that they're taking a greater risk. By the way, that's probably true for organic vegetables. What a controversial statement that is. Since when is manure inherently less likely to cause problems in terms of polluted product than, for example, nitrogen fertilizer? These issues come up all over the place, as Michael has pointed out. There is recourse through the legal system. If a bad actor puts out an inferior product, you can sue that individual through the legal system. The argument for that is we have a legal system, we have a tort system in place. The argument against it is often the person damaged has so few resources that they can't afford recourse to the legal system. So that is where legitimately you want the government to come in and ensure that there are consequences for putting an impure product into the marketplace. By the way, the entire land-grant university system derived from a case where a professor at Yale demonstrated that a lot of nitrogen fertilizer and other fertilizer that was being sold to, this is in the 1860s and 70s, was being sold to farmers that had no efficacy whatsoever. So there's a long tradition here of worrying about products that are unsafe. But Michael's points are really well taken in terms of where there is a legitimate health issue, then at the state and federal level, I would want the government to act. Now, how they act is a different matter. And I think that's Michael's point too. Right, Michael? Sure.
Yes, I think you bring up some good points, and you mentioned it again. Part of the conversation here is just to get us all to think through that one step beyond, and try to think about it. Are we looking at this through all angles? And Doc, you mentioned the fact that a lot of folks believe, or maybe even yourself believes, I don't want to put words in your mouth, there's no credible evidence to the benefits of raw milk. Yet, we mentioned earlier in this very meeting that in the state of Kentucky, the only way to get raw goat milk is through a doctor's prescription. And so I think, again, this just shows the complexity and the muddiness of the water here. And at the end of the day, it's a buyer beware type of deal. Consuming raw chicken can make you sick. Tobacco products, as the label mentions, can cause health related deals to folks or certain folks or what have you. And I think that I don't know any farmer, and we could, I know this is a big, long conversation as far as the pasteurization, and I would encourage people to go back and look at the doc who invented that process and discovered that process of cooking milk. And, I know a lot of dairy farmers. I worked on dairy farms in college. I milked cows every morning at 4 o'clock and have done so since to some degree. A lot of respect for those folks. I believe the best environmentalists in the country, if not the world, are agriculture-based folks. I am not throwing shade on anyone, regardless of the size of the farm. But pasteurization is really important. When you have an 18-wheeler milk truck pull up to your farm, gather your milk, and then he hits 20 more farms before he gets to the processing facility. If I've been a bad actor, I've tainted milk that's going to go to arguably tens of thousands of lunchrooms in the little bitty cartons in a tanker truck. That milk, arguably, it makes sense, would need to be pasteurized, because who knows what's in it? Who knows if there was one farm who was off their game that day? Most raw milk that's looking to be consumed is someone like Donna wanting to come to a farmer like me. If Donna gets sick and it's found out by her doctor, physician, that she's gotten sick from raw milk, there's arguably no question as to who the bad actor was, and it was me, and it was my farm. And so we believe that safety, if it's truly about safety, that if we're getting back directly to that relationship, a lot of these rules could be removed. But the doc brings up some really good points. And I would encourage people to look back and see when pasteurization came into the country and what made that come about. I'll just be real quick on this, Donna. Back in the teens and the 20s, a lot of cities have breweries and this type of thing. And rather than trying to transport before tractor trailers and mass automation, a lot of these breweries weren't able to take their spent grain from the cities out to where the cows were. So they thought, hey, let's bring the cows into the city. And they were putting cattle dairies into the basements of a lot of these breweries and feeding them the spent brewer's grain. Well, that's high in brewer's yeast. It was messing up the rumen chemistry of the cow's rumen, and therefore all kinds of illnesses broke out. You can go back and read historical accounts about what the milk looked like, what it tasted like, what it smelled like. It was rough. And so I forget the doc's name, is Pasteur or whatnot, who actually invented the process and discovered it, found out that, hey, food handling practices weren't good. People didn't even know to wash their hands and be sanitary. At that time, pasteurization made a ton of sense. Nowadays, when you have closed milking systems, when you have people that are doing grade A, all stainless on their farms, and again, I understand that dairy is a small part, or somewhat a small part of the big conversation, but raw milk is always an easy one to poke holes in, because again, it allows us to see the hypocrisy in the government's argument that they truly care about our health when there are so many holes already existing in the process.
So we've talked a bit here about...
just for a moment. Let me slightly disagree with Michael.
Okay.
Or at least raise a different issue. If you have what's called traceability, if you can know where your milk came from, that's one thing. And this is really the issue that Michael raised about the semi collecting from as many as 50 or 100 farms, depending on the size of the tank. If you cannot trace where the milk came from, then legal recourse is really difficult. So the flip side of that is, almost surely every country that has gone down this route has emphasized traceability. And traceability itself can be a costly enterprise for the farmer, because it adds costs at the farm level. It adds costs at the transportation level, because you have to document exactly where the product came from. And so one of the reasons why, when you go into a supermarket store in France, a product, say a cheese, will be more expensive in France than it is in the United Kingdom, is because of France's very rigorous traceability rules. So we have to balance out what we gain and what we lose in terms of regulation as we move to different regimes in one area. And so that's just the cautionary note.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. You know, the more regulation you have, then the cost of business goes up. And as a society, you have to determine what is, quote, worth it. What are we willing to pay in order to have a certain level? You know, we've been talking about food safety and consumers, and that's a big piece of the industry here. But I'd also like to talk a bit about the entrepreneurial quality in North Carolina and what the results of Professor Smith's report might show us. Michael, what are some of the industries, so I guess I would call them cottage industries, that are percolating here in North Carolina, that where we have farmers who may be very small and producing a very small quantity of product, but there's opportunity for them to grow?
Yeah, there's numerous. You see everything from, particularly with COVID, we saw an increase in talking with some friends over at the Department of Agriculture. We saw an increase in cottage industry applications because you had a lot of parents who all of a sudden with COVID, with kids not being in schools, one parent was at home, if not both working from home. And they were looking to, hey, I've always made my grandmother's cupcakes. They're wonderful. Everybody loves them. Maybe now's the time because we're all shut in with COVID. And so we've seen that bubble up across the spectrum, from plants and flowers to meat of all kinds. The biggest challenge with the current system as it relates to some of these hindrances is when we saw COVID unleashed, if you will, and we saw the supply and the availability of slaughter slots. I called a processor, I believe last June, to have some beefs slaughtered, and it was like a year and a half wait.
Oh my.
Well, the trouble is, a year and a half for a cow that I already have on my farm is a long time, and it arguably puts them past a certain threshold where you deal with a whole other set of things. Poultry, their lifespan is 8 to 10 weeks. Pigs is 5 to 8 months. Cattle is, you got, years. And so the trouble with the whole onslaught of COVID was that, farmers had these animals, they couldn't get them to market, and they were looking for an avenue to do so. A lot of this too is, I believe, the challenge and the pushback from a lot of your big conglomerates. And again, I believe the 3 largest meat packers in America are foreign owned to some degree. I believe there's a Chinese institution, Venezuelan, and a multinational. I believe a whole nother conversation is the national security element of other nations, some who don't even care for us having any control over our food supply. That should scare us and probably should be a much bigger, deeper conversation at some point. But what we saw was farmers who were ready to correct. We saw consumers wanting to talk to their local farmers. We saw farmers who were willing and able, but yet we saw this magic thing in the center, and that was government keeping all of this from happening and slowing things down. And so, we've seen a huge rise and a huge increase in small enterprises. But again, it's not that these farms and producers are dealing with a market that's not there, which is the case in, you're taught number one in any business class, make sure you have a market. The hindrance and the roadblocks they're hitting is regulation and government. And I'll also tell you, there's a farmer that was highlighted in Winston-Salem last year by a local newspaper. He had been milking 100 cows for 20 years, gotten out of the business because he was literally going broke milking 100 cows. He shut down, went to town and got a job. A couple years later, when the herd share bill passed, he came back on scene, and I think he started milking 10 cows, or he got up to 10 cows. He went from selling milk at somewhere around 50 to 60 to 70 cents a gallon, although it's sold by the weight, to being able to sell direct to consumer for $10 a gallon. And so a lot of even your big dairy producers are in favor of being able to sell to their neighbor, because to think that milk at a dairy that you can see from your house in somewhere rural North Carolina has to get put into an 18-wheeler, in some cases taken as far north as Illinois, pasteurized, bottled, and then brought back to North Carolina on a different type of tractor trailer, and can still be sold for less than $3 a gallon, is again because of a lot of government influence. And it's it's slowing the whole system down. It's making it a less prosperous North Carolina for our entrepreneurs. And I think you'd see the economy take a huge boom if we could get the government to take their thumb off the scale in a lot of places.
Well, to that issue, Michael, of course, agriculture #1 in North Carolina. In the state legislature, do we have champions who are seeing the opportunity here and seeing the roadblocks? In other words, what is the climate in the legislature to try to open this up to more small farmers?
Great question, Donna. We do have champions. In fact, we have them on both sides of the aisle. A lot of times the booming food market, this sort of new generation of food as it's defined in your farmers markets and your herd shares and all this stuff, your buying clubs are in the more urban parts. I mean, Raleigh, Asheville, Durham, these folks are booming with it. And we're even seeing it grow in the rural areas. Representative Rydell in the House was responsible for the herd share bill, has been a huge champion of ours. We've got some legislation before them now, but we've got folks on, of every creed from every corner of the state who are supportive. The downside is that, the Department of Agriculture, great people, they are a regulatory agency. And so when they testify in front of committees, they generally are in favor of regulation. And I believe most of them believe, and I believe, some is somewhat supported, that they're doing it out of a place of safety. But we believe there's a place where we can have safety and freedom. And frankly, we're lacking a lot of the latter right now.
Professor, as we wind down our conversation today, what would you like North Carolinians to know out of your report? What is the story of North Carolina? Are we hopeful about where we're going in North Carolina? Can you derive that from the data?
Well, North Carolina agriculture as a whole is both dynamic and productive and profitable. I mean, those three statements are correct. There are all sorts of challenges, regulatory challenges. We haven't talked about the hog industry, for example, where there have been over the years with respect to Murphy Farms and other operations, a conflict between, if you like, the city and the hog operation on a variety of domains. In terms of the two industries that we looked at, livestock and dairy, I'm very cautious about regulatory changes because I have this horrible habit of asking who's benefiting and at whose expense. So that applies to changes as well as to the establishment of a given regulation. There is a case to be made for substituting effectively outright bans for labeling regulations, which are relatively inexpensive. It doesn't cost a whole lot to change your label, in truth. You might hear a lot of complaints from very small operators. I got to do this, and it's not fair. But it's a one-time shift in their printing. And it's not, that's not a very expensive issue. On the livestock side, the biggest concern is what is the health of the animal at the time of slaughter? There is a risk, if that problem can be resolved, there's still a risk that a lot of money is made by cow-calf operators in selling into feedlots and then on into the packing plants from being priced on what's called the grid, which gives you substantial benefits for higher quality as opposed to lower quality animals. And getting that sort of return in a more informal market can be a challenge. So there are gains and losses, if you like, that are potential for small-scale operators. A very efficient small-scale operator with a high-quality herd in terms of marbling of the meat and so on stand to gain. Although we've looked at this issue a lot in Montana. and I know Montana's not North Carolina in any way, shape, or form. Our mountains are higher and our plains are drier. That's the way. But one of the problems for small scale butchering facilities is, what do you do with the parts of the animal that are valuable but impossible to market at a small scale, like hides and so on, where it's extremely costly to cure the hides, for example, but the hides and other parts of the animal we don't even think about account for 10% of the value of the animal in the marketplace. So the milk story, I think, is an easier story to adjust regulation than, in terms of potential benefits for the farmer, than when it comes to the to livestock, to cattle in particular.
Well, there's all sorts of details, folks, in the report that the professor has produced for the Locke Foundation. Again, it's called Freedom to Farm. You can find it at johnlocke.org. There's also a link to it in the comment section of our Facebook page. It's been a fascinating discussion, and just the first discussion. We plan to talk more with you about the agriculture industry in our state, the opportunities, the regulatory barriers. So over the next months, we're going to be having more guests. I suspect we'll have Professor Smith back as well. We'll talk about different things, including what Michael brought up about the national security issue with the food supply as well. All sorts of different angles to the story here. We will make sure that we keep you updated. We've been talking with Professor Vincent Smith. He is from Montana State University, and my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation, Michael Harden. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Interesting discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
We want to thank you as well, folks, for joining us, as you do, many of you, every single week here at Shaftesbury Society. We can't tell you how much we value your support, value your involvement, and your interest in keeping North Carolina free and, in fact, expanding freedom across different policy sectors. What I'd like to ask you today as we wind down is to consider this. Consider making a tax-deductible donation to help fuel the work here at the John Locke Foundation. You know the quality of our work. It is top-notch. Professor Smith and his report is a great example of the type of work that we're doing here with our research team, with our journalism arm at Carolina Journal. If you like this work, if you want to see more of it, remember we do rely on you, and we will be very grateful if you would make a tax-deductible donation to the Locke Foundation. Now, it's very simple and fast. Just go to johnlocke.org, and in the upper right-hand corner of the home page, you'll see the Donate tab. Just click on that. Takes you right to a secure portal. You can do that with your credit card. Takes you less than 2 minutes to make sure that you are part of moving North Carolina forward. Again, thank you for considering helping fuel our work. Hope you will join us again next week for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. On behalf of the entire Locke team, I'm Donna Martinez. Thank you for being with us. Have a great week, everybody.